Welcome to Crash Course, a podcast about business, political, and social disruption, and what we can learn from it. I'm Tim O'Brien. Today's Crash Course, Presidential Crimes and United States versus Donald Trump. Former President Donald Trump will walk into a federal courtroom in Miami, Florida today and face criminal charges for the second time in as many months. The indictment handed up last week charges Trump with misappropriating classified federal documents containing nuclear and military secrets and obstructing government efforts to both collect them and investigate their disappearance. It's potentially the most devastating legal action the 77-year-old developer, showman, and human wrecking ball has ever faced. And it's an utterly devastating account, filled with evidence that Trump knew what he was doing was wrong, and he did it anyway. Trump orchestrated the alleged crimes, according to the indictment. He wasn't just a bystander. Classified documents were hidden all over Trump's Palm Beach mansion, Mar-a-Lago. Some were stashed in a bathroom, underneath the chandelier. Trump allegedly asked one of his lawyers if it was okay to destroy some of the documents. U.S. v. Trump is a singular case. The first time an ex-president has been charged with crimes including obstructing investigations by federal agencies he once supervised and compromising national security through violations of the Espionage Act. It's a case that invites a robust discussion, and to that end, I invited George Conway to Crash Course. George, a graduate of Yale Law School, is an accomplished lawyer and conservative activist who Trump once considered for senior legal roles in his own administration. His wife, Kellyanne, was an advisor to Trump, and George is an acute observer of our shambolic political era. Howdy, George.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for making time for us today. You know, the first thing I want to talk about relative to the indictment is motive. Let's just talk a little bit about why he allegedly absconded with classified documents that had such deep-seated national security information in them that they were national security threats if they had gotten out into the wild. What do you think about Trump's motive in all of this, George?
You're asking me. I should be asking you the question. You're the biographer.
I know, but I'm the host too, so I want to give you a chance before I muscle in there.
Well, then I want you to pass judgment on my judgment after I get it. All right. So, look, my view of Donald J. Trump is, as you know, and as I have said, I guess way too many times, he is a narcissistic psychopath or a narcissistic sociopath.
Don't hold back.
No, well, I mean, the narcissist part of him means that everything is about him and everything belongs to him. My generals, my government, my people, my Article 2 powers, and so on and so forth. Everything belongs to him. Everything he touches, the world. I mean, he's the only thing that really exists in his world because he's such a pathological narcissist. And the psychopathic and sociopathic part of him is the part that, you know, one of the key elements of sociopathy is just pure impulsiveness and the inability to plan ahead and the inability to follow laws, rules, and norms. And that part of him tells me that he just thought the stuff was his. He was going to take it. He doesn't care what the law says. And it was his, and he will do whatever it takes to take it. And if you didn't do that when you were president, and you don't really exist because you're just, you know, you're a sucker and a loser. And so he's convinced himself that it belongs to him. He knows some people will say that's illegal, but, you know, he doesn't care. And now the people who are saying, well, he did it to sell for cash to the Saudis or to the Russians or to the whoever, I don't really buy that. I think he's capable of just about anything if he were asked.
I do think he thinks about how much money he can make on anything,
right,
almost every waking minute.
But he doesn't, like if you or I wanted to be criminals and we thought it through and we were planning, because we are actual people who think and plan, although we have moral consciences and we never do it, we would try to figure out a way of absconding with the documents in a way that no one would trace. And, you know, we try to use tradecraft because we don't want to get caught. And we plan it out very, very carefully. He's not capable of that because he's a sociopath. He's capable of doing the illegal.
He's also not capable of it, George, because he's ignorant.
Because he's a moron. Yeah, he's a moron. Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, people who can plan good crimes have a certain amount of discipline and strategic sensibility and just smarts, which he's lacking in a lot of those qualities.
That's true. And the two things reinforce each other, because psychologists will tell you that your brain, your ability to think atrophies if you are a pathological narcissist or a sociopath, because you don't ever think anything. You just say whatever the hell you want.
And, you're touching, the idea of the brain atrophying. He's in daily panic about that. His father, Fred Trump, died of Alzheimer's. And Donald is very aware and worried that that's going to happen to him, too.
Right. And that's why you have all that projection about Joe Biden and other people, Pelosi. But so anyway, so he just did it because, he's 5 years old and he said this stuff belonged to him. And if somebody's going to give him something for it, or if he can extract something for it along the way down the line at a given moment and on impulse, he'll do it. And that's sort of like if he could put it to use in some way that benefits him, like the way he waved around apparently that alleged Milley document in Bedminster, he'll do it, but it's not going to be pre-planned, and it wasn't really part of his motive in taking it. His motive was just to take it because it was valuable, and he convinced himself it belongs to him because the whole world belongs to him. So that's my armchair shrinks, unprofessional view of his motive. Official biographer, what grade do you give me?
I would give you, I think, we can't get into anybody else's head. This is probably the most speculative part of the conversation we're going to have today. But, I do think money is still a reasonable reason here. I think that's where he lives. The other thing I thought about after reading through the indictment a couple of times is he's also clearly concerned about the historical record, not in the way that, people who think about history are.
Yes.
But where, he wants to correct moments in his White House record where he's looked either buffoonish or trigger happy or a threat to the world because he wants to attack a random country.
Apropos of that, part of his motivation may have been they tried to trade some of this stuff. He wanted to trade this stuff apparently to NARA for the Crossfire Hurricane documents.
Right. And that's also think how bonkers that is.
It's insane. Right.
You're talking about the executive in the executive branch.
The former executive.
Thinking that, other parts of the government are there to be transacted with.
The former executive who is holding government property, exchanging it for other government property that doesn't belong to him.
Because it's like a real estate deal or hopscotch.
Right. Well, a hostage deal or something, right?
Yeah.
That is the most bonkers. There's so many bonkers things about this, from the chandelier over the toilet and the documents to him trying to trade the documents back to NARA for it.
I thought it was totally bonkers that there's a chandelier over the toilet. But then when you think about it, every seat is a throne if you're Donald Trump.
You've been to his Fifth Avenue apartment, right?
I've been to Mar-a-Lago, too. We had dinner there together.
I've never been to Mar-a-Lago. I don't think I'm ever going to get invited to Mar-a-Lago. It makes me very sad.
You're too late. You're way too late.
Maybe after the Fed sees it, I'll go and...
We can do a field trip. We can do a podcast.
Yeah, we can go on the U.S. Marshals real estate tour when they seize it.
Here's the next thing I want to talk to you about, the quality of the case. Because one of the things that also impressed me was how diligent these prosecutors have been about setting out a fact pattern that shows intent and knowledge. Trump was well aware of how important classified documents and classification were before he even took office, while he was running, clearly during office, and then even after his presidency ended, he's constantly talking in various situations about the importance of classification, which implies when he took things that were classified, he knew very well what he was doing. And I think that, that is one of the fulcrums that the case will pivot off of. But proving that to a jury is going to be something of a hurdle. But I wanted you to tell me what you think about the quality of the case.
Well, all we know about the case is really, we have three sources of information about the quality of the case. One is the indictment that we just saw. Two is the summer of 2022 search warrant affidavit the FBI presented to the magistrate judge to get the search warrant by which they raided, I know they hate that word, raided Mar-a-Lago. And the third is, press reports, which consist mostly, I think entirely, of information that defense lawyers and people around the Trump orbit have obtained from the investigation because their witnesses went in to talk to the FBI and to the grand jury. Now, just going on document one, what we just saw in the indictment, it's a practice in criminal pleading indictments, when you're drafting an indictment, as a prosecutor, although I was never a prosecutor, I can say this because it's elemental law school stuff. You don't have to plead evidence. You don't even have to plead facts. Civil cases and a complaint, you don't have to plead evidence either. And you really don't have to plead facts for the most part, except in certain circumstances.
But the civil cases have an easier bar to overcome around intent.
Right, but there's an easier bar around intent, but a higher pleading standard, interestingly. The government didn't have to put any facts in here. They could have just said, there were these documents, here are the numbers, and he took them, he was asked for them back, he lied, he concealed them. And this could have been a 5-page indictment. And instead, the government, Jack Smith and his office, prepared what is called a speaking indictment, which, like a speaking civil complaint, is something that actually explains the case in a manner in such detail that is not required by the rules, but is designed to let the reader know that the person bringing the case has the goods. And I have never seen a speaking indictment or a speaking complaint in a civil case as powerful as this speaking document.
It's also a very clear narrative. You know, it's linear, it's clear, it's damning, and it's loaded with information.
Right. It's linear, it's chronological, it tells a story. The story is easy to understand. I mean, in a lot of ways, this case is no more complicated than a nickel and dime drug bust on a street corner in Upper Manhattan that the feds bring dozens of times a month. So as a guy who's written a lot of speaking civil complaints, I like to lace in facts into the narrative so that when the judge starts reading about this before he starts making pretrial rulings, but he wants to see what the case is about, he knows, like, we're not screwing around. Usually, though, in that narrative, there's a lot of rhetoric. Hopefully not overblown, but, you know, we lawyers, we can't help ourselves, particularly in the private bar. The government can't really engage in that kind of rhetoric, and Jack Smith certainly doesn't do it because he is the ultimate straight-laced prosecutor. And so basically, this document is actually kind of terse, even though it is so detailed. It is a very, very...
It's Hemingway. It's Hemingway instead of Faulkner.
Absolutely. It's legal Hemingway. And it is literally, it has the density and power of matter packed in the black hole. It is that strong. Every paragraph, I mean, you know, I switched to an astrophysics metaphor, but...
Well, and the galaxy being pulled into that black hole is Donald Trump and his universe.
Yes, he is a black hole, as you know. I mean, you know, he's a shit show, he's a train wreck, he's a crash course, and he's a black hole. But it's so powerful on every page because it's got such material density. The whole document proves criminal intent for obstruction and criminal intent on withholding the documents under the Espionage Act beyond a reasonable doubt. There's evidence on every page that suffices to put this guy in jail. Like almost every paragraph.
And you know what else is throughout with all of the witnesses is they let them walk out on a branch and then you see them sawing the branch off behind them. And, you know, that's also, I think, really powerful.
And the reason why they were able to do that with such power and simplicity was because you don't have to draw any inferences. This stuff, it's on tape what they did. It's his own lawyer recording a history of Trump asking the lawyer to lie to the government. And his lawyer is dictating that in his car, and they're quoting that in the pleading. They've got timestamped video of Trump's aide moving this shit around.
Walt Nona.
And they've got that recording of Trump waving some piece of paper around at Bedminster after transporting the documents up and down the East Coast in his private jet. I mean, this is just literally, you could take 1/10 of, you could just take a page, rip a page out, a random page out of that document and present that evidence and get a conviction for a count or two. It's crazy.
So you have no doubt that Smith and his team will be able to persuade a jury that this is bad and it's criminal and a penalty should be imposed.
Correct. And I don't see how it doesn't go to trial. We'll see if Judge Cannon keeps the case. But if she does, she's got to present it to the jury. And if she screws around with the law and tries to dismiss the case.
Which she might, since she's a Trump appointee and there are questions about her suitability for her role even prior to this.
Right. It's not because of that she's a Trump appointee, because remember, the Trump appointees on the 11th Circuit slammed her and took the case away from her, and at least the earlier case. And, the Trump appointees put an end to Trump's election litigations. But it's because she was doing something other than judging the first time around. So that's why I think she should recuse herself, but I don't think she will. Anyway, but I think the case has to go to a jury. I think she's got to properly charge the jury. These are not complicated charges. And I think the best Trump can do, even if he has some Trumpy jurors who are going to ignore the facts, is get a hung jury, which means the case will get tried again. He can't get, there's no way.
Well, the other wild card, George, is she gets to decide the sentence once the jury's made its mind up, and she could completely lowball the severity of the sentence.
That's true. That is true. But he'll be a convicted felon by then. Maybe I'm being a little too optimistic about that, but I think there's a limit to what she can do. I think that this case is going to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And I think that you have to be able to trust juries, even people who come in with political biases. And I think the best evidence of that is actually with Donald Trump from the E. Jean Carroll case, because that jury, everybody thought, oh, it's a New York Manhattan jury. Well, it actually wasn't. It was a Southern District of New York jury, which includes some rural and suburban counties like Westchester, Orange, Putnam. And there were a number of jurors who were not from Manhattan.
From red counties.
Correct. And there was a juror who actually disclosed in the voir dire that he got all of his news from this Tim Pool podcast, which is a crazy right-wing podcast. And, people shouldn't listen to podcasts.
American, the Trump era.
Yeah, people shouldn't listen to podcasts by Tims, So that juror, notwithstanding that he was a Tim Pool fanatic, with a lunch break in 2 hours, he, along with the rest of them, voted to give Jean Carroll $5 million.
Right, in very short order.
I may be looking at this with rose-colored glasses or whatever, but I think there's hope.
The other thing, as we talk about how linear and crisp this indictment was, it made me stand in awe of Jack Smith, given the way other prosecutors have gone about their business in the Trump era. I think in my mind, most famously, Robert Mueller, a strong public servant, well-equipped, full of integrity, knows the law, and ends up creating kind of this booby trap
for himself.
Ultimately for himself,
right.
And then doesn't give others in Congress or in the prosecutorial world the kind of standing they need to go forward on clear problems in his investigation, including obstruction of justice. And his report was mammoth and long
and namby-pamby and, basically said
all over the place.
In 70 words what could have been said in 7, like, double negatives and whatnot.
Yeah, it landed like an anvil.
Yeah.
One of the other things is really interesting to me is Walt Nana himself, the naval officer who then got pulled into the MAGA world, enamored of Trump, and got a White House role, and then, was an aide and sort of the body man for Trump, and then they go to Mar-a-Lago together. And Walt Nana is all over this indictment too, and is in trouble, clearly. And it is one of the few moments that I can think of in Trump's whole history as a grifter and as a promoter and as a manipulator of other people, where he was so ham-handed about managing his relationship with the person who was helping him do his dirty work, in that he didn't distance himself enough from Walt Nana to create deniability for himself, which is how he's always used his lawyers. It's how he's used people who work for him. It's how he's used some of his own family members over the years. And this is a really glaring case at the point in time where Donald Trump needed to separate himself the most from one of his hatchet men. He didn't. And there's evidence all over the place that most of what Nana did, he was doing at Trump's direction.
Yeah, and I think it's essentially because he has been denuded of the protective sphere that he's had around him almost his entire life. Mary Trump's book really explained it well. I mean, she said that the man has essentially been institutionalized his entire life. His father took care of him, his family took care of him, his business took care of him, protected him.
Insulated by wealth, insulated by celebrity, insulated by the presidency.
Insulated by people who were beholden to him, and that continued in the White House. But now he doesn't really have as many people orbiting him, and they're far less competent. He doesn't have any good lawyers. He doesn't have any good people around him anymore. And he's a lot crazier than he ever was. And that's the reason he can't listen to people, he can't follow advice, and he's spiraling downward. And that's the reason why it's really just him and this one guy. And, he just
didn't. Three other lawyers, at least, at Mar-a-Lago who come in and out.
Right, but they testified against him. And Nauta is the guy hanging it because he was dealing directly with Nauta and not through a chain of people and doesn't have plausible deniability. And there are tapes, as there were with Nixon. And that's the thing. It's like Nixon, people wanted to send Richard Nixon to jail for what was kind of a cryptic comment in the smoking gun tape about, well, we could get the CIA to tell the FBI to back off. And that was like, oh, he knew about the cover-up. And that was the smoking gun that led the Republican leaders to go up to the Hill and say, you have no more support in Congress. And it's why people thought he should have been prosecuted after he left office for obstruction of justice. Well, in that case, the people who were on the ground doing the dirty work were like 4 or 5 layers away from him, and he didn't know about it. He got dragged into it late because those people were so incompetent. And it gradually worked its way. It's the cancer leading to the presidency that John Dean described. It sort of seeped its way up. Here, Trump was in the mud. Trump was at the Watergate. Trump was moving the boxes basically, going through the boxes basically himself as though he were like turning the door in the garage at the Watergate.
It was like he was giving Howard Hunt the tape to put over the lock on the door in the Watergate building.
And it's all on video when they did it. Timestamp
his own videos.
Right, yeah.
Not just a video. His own cameras at Mar-a-Lago recorded the obstruction of justice.
Right. I mean, the case against Trump makes the evidence about Nixon look chicken shit by comparison.
And, and all the witnesses in this are Trump supporters and or Republicans.
Yeah, just like the January 6th, the call was coming from inside the House, like repeatedly.
Speaking of a call coming from inside the House, I want to take a little break here, George, to hear from one of our sponsors, and then we'll come right back. Okay, we're back with George Conway, raconteur, Trump observer.
Raconteur. Oh, my God. I don't speak raconteur.
Raconteur. I think you do. I think you're a great storyteller.
Okay.
But we're talking about someone else who's a great storyteller, which is Jack Smith, the special counsel that Attorney General Merrick Garland appointed to look into Trump's possible criminal misdeeds, is a great legal raconteur in the way that a prosecutor needs to be. Short, sweet, and direct. We were talking before the break about Trump's inability to distance himself from people who would testify against him, which, despite his many failings, historically he is a survivor. He has sort of a reptilian sensibility about where peril lies and how fast he needs to scramble away from it, even if he's not a high-level thinker. He is a survivor, and he survived a lot of things.
Yeah, he's a mob boss. He basically has the instincts of a mob boss, but he's not as smart as a mob boss.
Right. He is not as smart as a mob boss or the mob boss's advisors. But he has always had other people around him to take the fall or to advise him how other people could take the fall.
Right.
And his father was his original consigliere, and then he graduated onto Roy Cohn, who taught him how to weaponize the courts against opponents and the press and many others. But Fred Trump and Roy Cohn were real world operators who grew up in the trenches, and they knew how the work got done, and they knew where you had to put padding around yourself. And more or less, Trump has gone steadily downhill since the late 80s, early 90s in the quality of his consiglieres. And you see in this Smith indictment just evidence of how chaotic and anarchic his advisory network around him was, including his lawyers.
Now more than ever. And he's run out of lawyers. The lawyers are all witnesses against him.
I think about the quality of the lawyers around him. And when you look at Alina Habba, who's become one of his chief spokespeople and was one of the attorneys at Mar-a-Lago engaging on all this, she comes from a very small New Jersey firm, maybe 5 people. They did local real estate work. At one point, she represented a parking garage operator. She's never touched national security issues. She's never contended with people of the caliber who come out of the Justice Department. And she's another one who's running out in front for Trump and is, based on her resume alone, does not come across at all as someone who should be in this situation. And yet Trump's leaning on her too.
Yeah, I mean, and Trump, more than that, I mean, he did have a couple of decent, I'm not going to say great, but like actual professionals. And they resigned the day of the indictment for whatever reason.
Right.
And all the rest of his lawyers, those were the only 2 basically who were any good and who weren't witnesses.
And you get a sense now that people are jumping off of a sinking ship now.
And Boris Epstein, he has a law degree, but he's never practiced law. He's not a lawyer.
And Boris Epstein, who all the lawyers who are capable around Trump have publicly cited as a force for disruption around their own legal strategy because he tells Trump what he wants to hear and gets in their way. He came into Trump's world because he and Eric were pals at Georgetown. And by virtue of that one relationship, he comes into Trump world. And Trump, as is his wont, if someone's loyal and hard-hitting, even if they're not top tier, he gives them a lot of authority. And again, he's got a person like this in the middle of his life while this sledgehammer of an indictment comes at him.
He's got no protection. That's why he was dealing with Nauta directly. He had no one to basically stop him from destroying himself. In the White House, remember, Don McGahn saved Trump a couple of times by refusing to do what Trump asked him to do.
Which became evidence in the Mueller
became evidence in the Mueller probe and actually was, evidence of obstruction. But he would have engaged in far worse obstruction
if McGahn hadn't told him to back down.
Right, or hadn't threatened to resign.
And the people at Mar-a-Lago, they're not even, it's not like back down. They're like, go further, do more.
Absolutely. And then they testify against him.
How do you think about this case amid the constellation of the ones that are still in play right now and others that have come before? But let's just talk about the ones that are staring at it right now. There's the Georgia case, voting fraud, which feels like a slam dunk to me. There is the Manhattan DA's criminal charge that I feel has less muscle. There's the New York State Attorney General's civil fraud case, which could be, financially perilous, but not existentially perilous. And then another thing that Jack Smith has on his plate, which is the January 6th investigation and probe, which may lead to insurrection charges and disrupting the government charges against Trump, sedition and insurrection and all the bad things. But that's an unknown still. Jack Smith is still working on that one. So where do you place this case amid the constellation of all the others I've just spoken about?
Oh, I've always placed this case as numero uno since the day we started to learn about it, because it is factually the simplest case. It is a very serious case. The Espionage Act counts, dozens of them, carry potential sentences of 10 years per count.
Some I think could go to 20, right?
And there's an obstruction count. I think it's the obstruction count that there's one that has a 20-year sentence. And this is serious stuff. And the evidence is basically undisputed. And, as the indictment makes clear, it's just a simple story to tell. And only two things that are complicated. One is there's just so much evidence pointing to the same thing. It's cumulative. I just have to sort through it and kind of simplify it for the jury. And the only other complicated thing potentially about it is the fact that it involves classified documents. There are procedural hurdles that must be overcome when you're dealing with presenting classified documents in court. You can't do it quite in open court. You have to take a lot of measures. Not only does Trump have to get lawyers, because he doesn't have any right now, he's got to get lawyers with security clearances or he can't defend the case. So it's really going to be interesting. The only thing he's got going for him is really the lucky draw of Judge Cannon again. That's basically the only thing he's got going for him.
There's one other thing in that indictment. There's at least one moment, there's maybe two, where I thought this to myself. But the Justice Department was very aggressive about piercing the veil of attorney-client privilege, between Trump and his lawyers. Yeah. And I think in at least one moment, I sort of wondered if the government is playing hardball there to such an extent that they look thuggish in an effort to pierce that veil. But that's just my read.
No, I don't think so at all. I think the fact that the chief judge of the United States District Court for the District of Columbia, apparently, we haven't seen the actual text of the opinion, I don't think has been unsealed, but wrote a lengthy opinion in which she explained the basis for concluding that Trump's attorney-client privilege should be pierced under the crime fraud exception. I'm sure she did a very thorough job. Judges don't like to do that. They are very protective. They understand the role of criminal defense counsel in criminal litigation and criminal
privilege.
investigation.
You know, the idea that you can have a confidential discussion with your attorney.
Right. And virtually all judges at one point, maybe except for a couple academics here and there, were practicing lawyers, all federal judges. And, you know, they understand the importance, the essential need for the attorney-client privilege in a fair system that guarantees due process of law. So it is very rare that you see the government obtain the kind of rulings that it obtained in this investigation. And that's because the evidence was just simply so strong.
So you don't think there's going to be any evidence that gets pulled on those grounds from this specific indictment?
No. You know, you look at the quotes from Corcoran, who is describing, apparently he was in his car or something, and he dictated his recollections of his interactions with Trump over the course of the investigation. They're basically describing how Trump was trying to get him to lie and to get others to conceal documents. There's just no question. He was trying to use his lawyers to carry out a crime and a fraud. And there's no privilege for that. There's absolutely no privilege. It goes away. It's really, really hard. It's a really high standard, but Donald Trump just amazingly managed to clear that hurdle. Very impressive. Very impressive. No, not many people could have done that.
Given how stark and damning this indictment is, how do you feel about Trump's various GOP defenders and enablers who have come out on his behalf to essentially slag the federal government and its intentions?
It's shameless. It's awful. It is immoral. It is unpatriotic. It is disgusting. And now it's par for the course. And it's very dangerous because this is what we have in our country that keeps us from basically resolving all disputes with guns and knives, is the rule of law. And for basically the bulk of an entire party leadership to cast off the rule of law and to show contempt for the rule of law and contempt for the enforcement of law is a very dangerous thing. I mean, this is one of our two major political parties, and they basically have forsaken the legal system.
And, you know, stated on numerous occasions that they think that Trump properly exercised presidential authority to declassify information when he removed from the White House, and therefore there's not a case here. Any number of them have said that, and
it's crazy. It's
and they're
completely
reading
insane.
into authorities the president doesn't have.
Correct. I mean, it's based upon a bizarre, anti-textual, contrary to reality reading of the Presidential Records Act that was promoted by Tom Fitton, who's not even a lawyer. Basically, it says that, oh, all the president's documents belong to him. No, that's not what it says. It literally says in one of the first provisions that everything that the president touches in the course of his official duties that he gets from his subordinates belongs to the United States of America, and it goes to the National Archives on January 20th at noon of a post-election year. So it's incredible, but they will tell any lie, make up any story to protect Donald Trump. It's really disgusting and outrageous.
On that happy note, I want to take another break, George, and hear from our sponsors. We're back with George Conway, lawyer, analyst, and guest today on Crash Course. We're talking about the indictment of Donald Trump by the federal government last Friday. Donald Trump is going to get walked into a federal courthouse in Miami today to face a bit of a reckoning. We were talking before the break, George, about Trump's defenders and enablers in the GOP. You know, Trump often gives people a playbook. One of his playbooks has been to attack prosecutors and immediately call into question their bona fides and the nature of the prosecution. Basically, everything's a witch hunt. He never talks about the merit of the investigations. And he wasted very little time attacking Jack Smith as a coward. And the intensity and the fact that he watched Smith on TV said something to me, because Donald Trump doesn't really care about most people. As you noted at the top of the show, he's a profound narcissist. But he closely studies the people he fears, the people he admires and envies, celebrities and athletes, and the people he wants to court or corrupt. And he pays a lot of attention to them. And the only reason I think he's paying this much attention to Jack Smith and talking so publicly about it is because he's scared of Jack Smith.
Of course.
He knows what Jack Smith has.
That's absolutely right. I mean, and all of what you hear is psychological projection. He's just driven by politics and corrupt and insane. I mean, it's just all pure projection. It's just classic Donald Trump.
Another thing I think this indictment does, and the fact pattern it has made public, is it blows apart the idea that Donald Trump is so utterly clueless, ignorant, and lawless that he doesn't even know sometimes that he's breaking the law. He's so out on his own lunar planet that proving intent with somebody like him is hard because he specializes in know-nothingism. But what this case shows is his intense engagement with hiding these boxes and moving them around because he knew what he did and he knew what he was doing.
Right. He knew what he was doing. He knew what he was doing was illegal. He knew what he was doing was something that he didn't want people to know about. He knew that what he possessed was something he wasn't allowed to have, so he told people, go pluck the stuff out, literally. And he knew he just doesn't care. The rules don't apply to him. He doesn't care. And that's classic sociopath right there.
Well, and in this case, he went from not caring because they were his to rushing through an attempt to cover it all up and to hide the documents. Again, he clearly knew.
Right. And he brought it all on himself because despite the volume of the classified stuff he had taken, if he had just allowed NARA in, I don't know, was it May of 2021 to come into Mar-a-Lago and search the entire place and take every single document so that there was clearly nothing left, I don't know that we would have ever heard about this case, even though there was a truckload of stuff. So he really did it to himself.
An epic cell phone.
Right. I think if he had turned the stuff back over, despite the sensitivity of it, despite the volume, I mean, NARA probably would have told the Justice Department that, yeah, there were some classified documents in there, there would have been some kind of investigation, but the conclusion would be, I think, this wasn't great, but given the chaos that ensued in the final days of the Trump administration, we can't say that he did this with some kind of nefarious intent. And that's illustrated by the fact that he gave the stuff back. And so that's essentially what is happening with Pence with a far smaller volume of documents than is going to happen with Biden with a very small number of documents. If they gave the stuff back, the stuff was just mixed in with other stuff. And that happens. It happens all the time.
And they gave it back as soon as it was asked after.
Correct. And they voluntarily turned it over, in fact.
Even though it's also bonkers that Biden was keeping the stuff stashed in his garage, and he bragged about that.
It is bonkers, but it just doesn't rise anywhere near to this level. And then, they talk about Hillary and lock her up.
For a raft of email that was largely inconsequential after...
I mean, she shouldn't have done it. It was a bad idea.
She shouldn't have done it. It was reckless. It also is in keeping with some of the way the Clintons have rolled historically around this kind of stuff themselves. But this isn't a different world than what Donald Trump has done.
But there weren't documents involved that said classified. I mean, may have been traces of classified information discussed in emails, but not actual classified material stamped classified.
It was reckless and irresponsible. She wasn't selling the country out by, trying to let national security secrets get out into the wild.
It was just dumb.
And, that's one of the sort of karmic, I think, realities of this case is that Donald Trump in 2016 made hay by attacking Hillary Clinton's integrity and her own recklessness with email. And the media turned email into a cudgel against her. But again, what goes around comes around.
I mean, she deserved it to some extent. But the fact is that the hypocrisy is just incredible.
Every leader deserves to be criticized about slipping or falling down on the job. But Hillary Clinton didn't break any laws.
Correct. She wasn't a criminal.
One of the signal moments to me in the indictment is that July 2021 meeting at Bedminster, Trump's golf course, where he's talking about a military plan of attack document that was, as Trump said, according to a recording of that conversation, which, by the way, he let someone sit and record these things in front of him, in which he said the document was, quote unquote, highly confidential, quote unquote, very secret.
And I can't show it to you. I didn't declassify. And then he waves it around and said, don't get too close. I mean, it's just insane.
Yeah. And he says to them, see, as president, I could have declassified it.
But I didn't.
Now I can't. But this is still a secret.
Yeah.
And someone laughs and says, yeah, now we have a problem.
That's a problem. Yeah.
And Trump replies, isn't that interesting?
Right. He understood it was legally a problem, and he didn't care. He just didn't care. It was just the cavalierness of it is just beyond.
And he's unsuitable for office, this alone.
He's unsuitable for office, and I think people in the national security field are just absolutely bonkers about how cavalier he was about this stuff and outraged.
The indictment notes Trump saying back in 2016, a few months, I think, before the election, that no one will be above the law in his administration. That, of course, is one of the larger issues that is present in much of the prosecutions around Trump and the legal criticisms of his role as president, is that he actually does think he's above the law. He thinks Article 2 allows him to be a monarch rather than a president.
And if you follow the law, you're a sucker.
Yes.
A good lawyer gives me a way around the law and protects me from it.
Well, and my own ego and lawlessness enables me to do it anytime I want, regardless of what the lawyer says, too, because that's how I roll.
Correct. And I'm not going to have it any other way.
But this came up when Congress was trying to get his tax records, and they wouldn't turn them over. They believed that the documents shouldn't go into the hands of the Democrats in the Congress.
Even though the statute specifically made clear that it had to go to Congress.
Yes.
I mean, it's crazy.
And Roberts said as much in his own ruling on it. And he said, no one is above the law. In fact, especially the president isn't. And he was talking about tax matters back then. Is your view that we've gotten to a place now where the GOP believes in such a strong executive that they do believe the executive should be above the law in order to create policy and social changes that they support? Or do you think this is just grotesque, immoral, craven political transactionism?
Yes.
Because they've realized that playing on people's fears and racism and other nefarious factors is an effective path to power?
Yeah, the answer is no to the first part of it and yes to the second part of it. And what I mean is it's not about a belief in presidential power, because they would be the first people to attack a Democratic president who did this stuff. It's not about presidential power. It's about power. It's about their own power. And they believe that their president, who's doing things that they like, should be entitled to break the law and be unaccountable to the law. But the other side should be locked up. And it's purely political. It's purely a power play. It's purely cynical. And it is absolutely the antithesis of the rule of law that binds this country together.
You know, when we were speaking earlier about motive, there's a quote in that indictment where Trump is bragging to a writer and flashing a classified document to prove that the media had misreported a military issue in his White House. And he says to the writer, this totally wins my case, you know, about this document. And he's saying this totally wins my case in the media sense of what he's saying. But what he's not at least cognizant of or in touch with is that it set him up to lose this very important case that's now facing him.
Absolutely. I mean, he just self-sabotages. There's just no question about it.
George, we always like to ask guests what they've learned. So what have you learned about Trump and the law that you didn't know before this indictment was filed?
Honestly, nothing. I always believed that sooner or later he would blow himself up. I couldn't tell you how. I thought it would come sooner rather than later. But I always thought he was going to do something that was so egregious as he got away with more and more things and became more and more reckless and more cavalier and more out there. And that he would ultimately do. If you told me after January 6th that this actually isn't the thing, January 6th isn't the thing that's going to take him out forever, because there are things we don't know about that could come out, I would say, I'm sure that's true. And so in a sense, none of this surprises me. I mean, I was shocked by, the evidence that was presented in the search warrant.
Well, so let me rephrase it that way. Was there something about this specific indictment that was a learning moment for you?
No, I mean, it wasn't. I mean, I think it's, as I said, I think it's a magnificent pleading, and I think it's really well done. I think the evidence is astounding. I think it is the most historic criminal case probably brought since the treason prosecution of Aaron Burr in 1803 or 4 or whatever. But it is the logical conclusion to Donald Trump. It absolutely is. I mean, there may yet be something else that we don't know about that's even worse. There is no bottom with Donald Trump. There never has been, and there never will be.
But the myth that he's untouchable by the law has been fully blown up.
Yeah, and I think Gene Carroll basically put the first nail in the coffin.
And there's still more to come.
Many more nails.
But George, we've run out of time. Thanks for getting together today. We've been having these conversations for too long now.
Thank you, sir.
George Conway can be found all over your TV screens and on Twitter at GT Conway III. Here at Crash Course, we believe the collisions can be messy, impressive, challenging, surprising, and always instructive. In today's Crash Course, I learned that the federal government's suit against Donald Trump is even more airtight than I believed it to be. And let me tell you, I thought it was airtight the first time I read it. What did you learn? We'd love to hear from you. You can tweet at the Bloomberg Opinion handle, @opinion, or me, @Tim O'Brien, using the hashtag Bloomberg Crash Course. You can also subscribe to our show wherever you're listening right now and leave us a review. It helps more people find the show. This episode was produced by the indispensable Anna Mazarakis, Moses Ondam, and me. Our supervising producer is Magnus Henriksen, and we had editing help from Sage Bauman, Katie Boyce, Jeff Grocott, Mike Nitza, and Christine Vanden Beilart. Blake Maples does our sound engineering, and our original theme song was composed by Luis Guerra. I'm Tim O'Brien. We'll be back next week with another Crash Course.